For today's topic is on the impact of systemic barriers in criminal exploitation with Susanna Clapclot. Susanna is a complex safeguarding social worker in the north of England and also a frontline fellow, having completed a pro-social work and Step Forward. She has committed her career to supporting vulnerable children affected by criminal and sexual exploitation. This dedication has driven her to undertake the research explored in this session. So I'll just hand over to Susanna to take us through today's session.
Thank you so much. It's so great to be here with everybody, and thank you all for attending. I'm so looking forward to sharing this research or presentation with you on something that I'm really passionate about. I also want to acknowledge that this presentation or this research does have some heavy topic discussion in it, and that may prompt some really difficult feelings or difficult conversation. But I also want to encourage everyone to reflect on those feelings as well, and to also sit within those feelings and think about how we can move forward to bring change in that as well. So great introduction on what I do and my research, and again taking the research that this presentation is about and moving that into a short film, which I'm currently crowdfunding for. If you want to know anything about that project, please find me on LinkedIn, and if you're interested in supporting it in any way, all the information is on there. So my research asks this question: how does institutional racism limit our capacity to assign victim status to Black and Brown adolescents, and what are the consequences? So this question and the research really came from my observations as a complex safeguarding social worker, working with adolescents, but also finding that I was having to advocate and challenge a lot more, in particularly for Black and Brown adolescent boys, to have professionals see them or assign them victim status. And I questioned why that was, where this came from, and what could be done to move forward or to move through that, to offer equal care to all children. So thinking about the issue of child criminal exploitation, we know that child exploitation is a growing concern. We know that it's widespread and something that we need to address. We also understand within that there's also a problem that we have no clear definition or a national strategy as to what child criminal exploitation is, or CCE, and how to approach it within the criminal justice system and on a national level. As of yet, we are working towards it. But without that legislation and the clear definitions, it leaves professionals to make own judgment calls on who qualifies as a victim. And that in itself opens doors to bias. And this bias, I found disproportionately affects Black and Brown boys who are already overrepresented in formal institutions like the criminal justice system. So let's look at some of those statistics within criminal exploitation. If we could go to the next slide. So in 2021, we see that 80% of CCE referrals into the NRM. So the NRM is a national referral mechanism, the UK system of identifying and supporting victims of modern day slavery, exploitation, and human trafficking. So in 2021, 80% of CCE referrals were boys with an average age of 15 to 16. Of data captured by the Home Office in 2023, we saw a 45% increase in NRM referrals. However, it suggested that of that 45% in referrals, 71% of the children referred were from minoritized backgrounds. So we could suggest that Black and brown children are being identified as victims. However, it also notes that of those 71% referrals for Black and brown children, there was a noted lack of evidence submitted and a lot less detail that was also part of those referrals. So then it kind of asked that question, is our care for adolescent Black and brown children equal to those and how we work with their white peers? Next slide, please. So thinking of the issue of racial disproportionality, according to the Youth Justice Board in 2021, 46% of Black children were assessed as being a significant risk to themselves or to others. In the 2017 LAMI review, which I highly recommend everybody read, it was stated that Black children score more highly as being riskier and reasoned this to be the significant driver of disproportionality in custodial sentences. So where does this idea of being riskier come from? When we think about the constructs of Black people as being aggressive, dangerous, angry, and inherently bad, a narrative that has followed Black people from the days of colonialism and being passed down to their Black children, we're offered some explanation into how these narratives and bias influence our assessments and thereby our responses. So, for instance, 73% of Black individuals in stop and searches, and when I say individuals, I'm talking about Black youth, are NFA'd or have no further action against them. So we can suggest then that this systemic targeting of Black males in stop and searches or Black youth in stop and searches are more about surveillance rather than evidence of need. Next slide, please. So staying with the criminal justice system and looking at the youth justice system in particular, we can see a serious problem with a disproportionality for Black children in the youth justice system across England and Wales. This data shows that while Black children make up only 6% of the 10 to 17-year-old population, their representation steadily increases at every stage of the justice system. So, for example, if we think about stop and searches, we can see that 20% of these cases involve Black children compared to 66% for white children. But then by the time we look at custody rates, this disparity increases even more, where we see 26% of children in custody are Black, whilst only 50% are white. Next slide, please. Just a quote here from Goff. I think the systemic criminalisation of Black youth is perhaps the clearest indicator that age and innocence is no protection for youth of colour in this country. And just thinking there about what Goff says in terms of innocence. In 2014, Goff completed a study that examined how police view Black boys and their innocence and their perceived innocence. And the study is a reminder of the deep-rooted biases and how these can shape outcomes and why we need to work to change these perspectives. So in the outcomes, Goff determines that the perception of innocence for Black boys begins to alter from the age of 10, where it's diminished in the eyes of police. By the time that Black child reaches the age of 10 to 13, they're no longer viewed as innocent and categorized with non-Black children aged between 14 and 17. By the time that same Black child reaches the age of 14 and 17, the key age where children are groomed and exploited, they are then viewed by police as the equivalent of an 18 to 21-year-old white adult male. So we can see that Black children are prematurely viewed as adults. And again, problematic where children are most likely to be groomed into CCE between the ages of 15 and 17. And thereby this suggests that innocence in the eyes of police has completely diminished for that child. So what is the impact of that diminished innocence? This leads us to adultification. So although adultification can affect all children from all backgrounds, it disproportionately affects Black and brown children due to systemic racism and those lasting impacts of colonialism. Essentially, it's where children are perceived as being a lot older or more mature than they actually are. This leads to typical childhood behaviours being misinterpreted, those behaviours that we would normally associate with adolescent development being misinterpreted, taking away their innocence and their vulnerability. So instead of receiving support, these children may be viewed with suspicion or with blame. And then in cases of exploitation in particular, they may be treated as if they're responsible for their own victimization, which we know is fundamentally wrong. In terms of legislation, it states that children cannot consent to exploitation. So this misjudgment often results in children being pushed into the criminal justice system rather than receiving the understanding and assistance they truly need. Next slide, please. My research also considers the ideal offender. In 2019, NAFSTAD criticised the ideal victim theory as theorised by Neil Christie. Neil Christie suggests that there are key traits that must be present in an individual being assigned victim status. Those key traits being perceived innocence and vulnerability, which we've just seen in the issue of diminished innocence and adultification. NAFSTAD argues against Christie's theory, suggesting that it overlooks the minority people or minority community, where othering will often interrupt victimhood. He points out that until minorities are able to appropriate into a majority culture, they forfeit legitimate victim status. So thinking about othering, this is the act of viewing or treating a person or a group as fundamentally different from a majority. It reinforces the idea that they don't belong, often leading to discrimination or exclusion. It dehumanizes the person, and so we see those vulnerabilities, those innocences stripped away. It then creates this ideology that, again, minoritized people must assume into majority culture to be afforded victim status. Problematic where Blackness is inescapable, not just by physical appearance, but in the false portrayal and understanding of Black identity as portrayed in media. So if we link this back to adultification and lost innocence, and we combine this now with othering within this ideal offender theory, the Black and brown child is prematurely positioned as the ideal offender, and assessments of him rooted in bias and assumption. Next slide, please. So we must ask the question, is it right to expect Black and brown children to abandon their identities, their cultures, to be recognised as victims? Should the harm and abuse experienced through their CCE be evidence enough? As professionals, it's our responsibility to challenge our biases and our assumptions. Our assessments must move away from being racialized to being reflexive, curious, and evidential. Next slide, please. So thinking about the impact of what we've just looked at, racial bias within institutions not only makes space for harm, but also creates a mistrust for Black and brown families that feel unseen, unheard, over-policed, and creates further alienating from them seeking help or feeling that they're able and positioned to seek help. It negates any equality in accessing rehabilitation and safeguarding resources designed to protect them from exploitation harm. So addressing these disparities requires a commitment to dismantling our biases. So if we think about the serious case review, where we see this impact of these racial biases, the serious case review of Corey Junior Davis, or CJ. 14-year-old CJ had told social services that he needed protection from violent gangs who were trying to coerce him into selling drugs. However, he was responded to by professionals within children's services more so as a criminal and not as a victim. Even when it was made known that he'd bought a bulletproof vest and a knife to protect himself from his perpetrators. In September 2017, Corey was unfortunately shot and killed in what remains to be an unsolved murder, but what is also believed to be linked to his exploitation experiences. This quote comes from Dr. Nicholas Marsh and his PhD that he's recently completed. A quote that comes from a social worker. I worked with lots of black boys when I worked in London. Black boys were more mistrustful of statutory services, and I can see why. I saw how differently professionals treated them. It goes much deeper than individual social workers, but we can all start to make sure we take responsibility for our practice. Next slide, please. So what does it look like to take professional responsibility? And what is the impact of that as well? This is an example of 16-year-old Cameron that I was working with. He was arrested for assaulting an opposing gang affiliate with a machete. And he also had separate charges of possession with intent to supply and a separate incident of a knife point robbery. Initially, professionals believed him to be a perpetrator and making choices around criminality rather than a victim. However, my trusted relationship with Cameron allowed me to really understand his position as a victim, his experiences in grooming, and how that started from the age of 11 when he started high school. And it also allowed him to feel comfortable in a safe space to make a disclosure of his exploiters. Alongside that, I was able, again, from that relationship and that information that was shared, to bring together a robust NRM referral with evidence submitted that supported his status as a victim. With all of that combined and that evidence to support, Cameron was able to avoid a custodial sentence, and he's now doing really well. He is in further education, moved away from his exploitation, and is no longer involved in any kind of criminality. Final slide, thank you. So, key takeaways from my research and from what we can do as professionals supporting Black and Brown children within CCE. Firstly, to read. What do we understand of the experiences of Black and Brown children? How can we commit to learning about adultification, racial trauma, and anti-racist practice? Really wanting to develop that knowledge and having that learning ongoing. And to take that learning and those experiences and to reflect, to be transparent about our own biases, to be able to reflect on these with others so we're accountable to those biases, asking the questions, where does my thinking come from? Why do I use certain language in assessments, in meetings with Black and Brown children? Who do I hold myself accountable to? And for professionals in position of management, are we looking at social graces, for instance, in supervision. Are we reflecting in supervisions with our team around biases, around assumptions, around where our decision making is coming from? And then finally, investing authentically in relationships with the children that we're working with. Those intentional relational investments spark naturally curiosity, wanting to understand that child, where they've come from, their background, their culture, their experiences with police, with exploitation. And in that curiosity, it allows us to see that child as a child and as an innocent child. Thank you so much for your time. And I think we've got some time for questions.
Yeah, we do. Thank you so much, Susanna. Really interesting and thought-provoking, stimulating presentation. So no doubt that we'll have a number of questions. Just before we get any posted through, just obviously in your final slide there, you kind of recommend kind of reading and kind of that learning that needs to take place. Is there any kind of key authors or key texts or materials that you could maybe highlight for people to maybe consider?
Yeah, of course. I What I can do is I will share my research, and it has everything that I would consider to be key in terms of what we've just talked about, and kind of that further reading within that research as well. And I'll add a few others to that.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Susanna. And just in terms of, you've highlighted that and the example that you provided um, for Cameron in terms of that relational approach. What what was it that you did in terms of to create that relationship with him? If you could maybe provide, a little bit more examples of how you approached interactions or in terms of that very deliberate relational approach.
Yeah, and I think that's it, Ross. I think it is. It has to be deliberate, and it has to be consistent, and it has to be reliable as well. At that point, Cameron had been let down by a lot of professionals, and he didn't trust professionals and was very guarded, very closed. So that consistency and keeping to my word helped him to see something different in how I was working with him, but also initially meeting his priority needs first, what he felt was important for him. And again, that created a trust that he saw I was responding to his needs, what he needed in the immediate, which allowed him to trust me. And then that relationship grow naturally. And I think it's just also, like I said, being authentic. Children know when it's insincere and when it's genuine. And when it feels genuine, those barriers start to come down and those conversations start to become more meaningful.
Great. Thank you, Susanna. We've got a question that's come through from Isabella. She thanks you for your amazing presentation, first of all, but she asks, what else can I do as a white practitioner to support Black and Brown young people whilst not being able to understand their experiences of systemic racism?
I think education, educating yourself through reading, reports. There's been a report released recently that looks at anti-racist practice and the impact of racist practice in safeguarding institutions or systems, and that's a key read. I can't remember what it's called, but I'll send that to Ross to kind of share out. But yeah, reading, education, speaking to colleagues that have potentially had that research, those experiences. Um, but I think as well, it's not being afraid, and I do it as well. Working with children from Muslim backgrounds, from Asian backgrounds, I'll ask them about their experience, and they appreciate that I'm genuinely asking, what's it like in your position? what is it about your culture that I need to understand? Why would your parents respond that way culturally? What does that mean? So again, having that open dialogue with the children you're working with goes a long way even to building that trusted relationship as well as that learning for yourself as well.
Yeah, great, thanks. I think you touched on earlier that word kind of having curiosity, and I
Mm,
think being willing to learn and putting yourself out there that you actually want to understand what somebody's lived experience is. I think is really
yeah.
important. But thank you.
I think
So, sorry, go
sorry,
on.
I was just gonna say in any relationship that you build outside of work, um, when you genuinely are interested in somebody and want a relationship with them, there is a natural curiosity that you don't even have to think about that happens. You know, you want to know every part of that person. So, and it's not something that you're striving to bring into your practice. So that's why I say that those relationships and those desires to have relationship need to be authentic because those natural things of curiosity, reflection, reflexivity, they all start to happen within that.
Great, thanks, Susanna. Got a question that's come through from Janine, who again thanks you for your presentation, but asks kind of explicitly, how do you talk to young people about this so they know how they are viewed and help them to navigate this?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I think it's probably a bit different because, I am a brown woman talking to brown black children. So it probably feels a little bit more natural to kind of open up that conversation. But I think if we're talking to children about who they are, their identity, and their experiences, I think it naturally comes from that. And again, that curiosity coming from that as well. Um, you know, if I know a child's been arrested and or stop and search, how did you feel about that? How did that make you respond? What did you think in that moment? What do you want to talk about? Is there anything we need to talk through? Because it's that understanding again that comes from learning education that stop and searches create a racial trauma. So a lot of the presentations that we see, which we might address as being hostile, aggressive, they're actually presentations of racial trauma. So it's having that conversation. How did you feel? Why did you feel like that? What do you need to help you through those feelings as well? I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's difficult without exploring it a little, understanding, but I think it's about, you know, would you have explicit conversations about how young people experience racism? Would you actively talk about that and explore that with them?
Absolutely, yeah. Young people want to be seen and heard about what they've gone through and their experiences. So, to give an example, I recently met with a um, a guy, JW, I'll call him, and it was my introductory visit. I told him about what I do, how I'd be working with him, and asked for his consent. And he said yes straight away. He consented to working with me. And then he said, actually, no, do you work with X person? I said, yeah, that's a police person on my team. And then he said, absolutely not. I will not work with you because I've had experiences with that person and they treated me like I was a grown man. And his words were, I literally had to say, I'm just 15, stop treating me like an adult. And so I had to then have that conversation with him. Um, how did that make you feel? That's not, that's something that we can work through. And I apologize that you were made to feel that way. And it really opened up a door to explore his feelings, his experiences with police, with the criminal justice system, and to show him some empathy. Even though we may not fully understand the experience of that child, we can show empathy, especially if it's genuine. We need genuine empathy and attempt to understanding. And then in the end, he said, "Yeah, I agree. I'll work with you." So, again, it all comes back to that authenticity and allowing a child to feel seen and heard.